Welcome to a story that begins with a shipwreck and ends with a philosophy that has never stopped being true. A story about a man who lost everything and in losing everything discovered the only thing that cannot be taken away. This is not a story about power or conquest or the building of empires. It is a story about something quieter and stranger and in the end far more durable than any of those things. It is a story about a man who looked at the chaos and cruelty of the ancient world and asked a question that nobody before him had asked with quite this kind of precision and quite this kind of courage. What is actually in our control? The man who asked this question was named Zeno. He was born around 334 BC in the city of Citium on the island of Cyprus. He was not Greek by blood. He came from Phoenician stock, a heritage that made him an outsider. From the very beginning in a Greek world that placed enormous value on the accident of birth. He was dark-skinned and lean, and by the accounts of people who knew him, slightly awkward in his manner. Not the kind of person you would look at in a crowd and think, "There stands a man who will change the way human beings understand themselves." But that is exactly what he did. Before we go any further, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now settle in, because what you are about to hear has been relevant for more than 2,000 years, and it is, if anything, more relevant now than it has ever been. To understand what Zeno was responding to, you have to understand the world he arrived in. Cyprus in 334 BC was a place caught between empires. The great Persian Empire had long claimed the island as part of its vast dominion, stretching from the Aegean to the borders of India. The Greek cities of the Mediterranean world were constantly pressing against Persian power. And just a few years before Zeno's birth, a young Macedonian king named Alzan had begun his astonishing campaign of conquest that would within a decade overturn everything. Every border, every alliance, every assumption about who ruled the world and how. This was the background noise of Zeno's childhood, the sound of a world being remade by force. Enormous forces moving enormous distances and overturning everything in their path. Whole cities falling and whole peoples being swept into new arrangements they had not chosen and could not resist. It was a world in which the fact of being a Phoenician in a Greek city on an island claimed by Persians was a constant reminder that your identity was something that other people were always ready to define for you and then use against you. The Phoenicians were an ancient trading people whose cities dotted the eastern Mediterranean coastline. They were the great navigators and merchants of the ancient world, the inventors of the alphabet that Greek itself was written in. People of extraordinary commercial intelligence and seafaring skill, but in the Greek cultural hierarchy they occupied an awkward position. Admired for their wealth and their practical abilities, looked down upon for not being Greek, not possessing the ancestral connection to Athens or Sparta or Corinth that conferred status in the world Zeno was moving through. Cyprus itself was a complicated place. It had been colonized by Greek settlers in the Bronze Age and had absorbed Greek culture and language, but it retained its Phoenician trading communities and its connections to the wider Eastern Mediterranean world. It was neither purely Greek nor purely Phoenician, but something in between. A cultural crossroads where the categories that mattered so much to mainlanders were blurrier and less absolute. Growing up in this in-between world may have given Zeno an early education in the arbitrariness of the categories by which people organized their social hierarchies. He could see from early on that the distinctions that seemed so fundamental to the people who made them, the distinctions between Greek and barbarian, between citizen and foreigner, between highborn and lowborn, were not written into the nature of things. There were conventions, arrangements that served certain interests and excluded others. Arrangements that had been made by human beings and could be examined and questioned by human beings. Citium itself was a prosperous merchant city. Zeno's father Nacius was a merchant who traveled widely and who brought back books from Athens on his trading voyages. Books that the young Zeno read with the hunger of a mind that had found exactly what it needed. The writings of Socrates as reported by Xenophon. The dialogues of Plato. The questions that the Athenian philosophers had been asking for a century. About how a human being ought to live. These questions seized Zeno the way the compass seized young Einstein, with the force of something that would not let go. Here were men who had decided that the most important question in the world was not how to acquire more territory or more wealth or more power, but how to live well. How to be the kind of person whose life was worth living. How to achieve something. That they called eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, but meaning something richer and deeper than that word usually suggests. Something closer to flourishing, to being fully alive in the right way. The contrast between these philosophical texts and the world outside the window must have struck Zeno with particular force. The world outside the window was one in which Alexander was busy conquering everything in sight, in which cities were being destroyed and populations enslaved, and the map of the known world was being redrawn at the point of a spear. In which the question of how you ought to live was entirely secondary to the brute question of whether you would survive. In which the philosopher in the marketplace was a luxury that only a very peaceful and prosperous civilization could afford. Zeno was a merchant like his father. He traded in purple dye, the luxury commodity of the ancient world, extracted painstakingly from sea snails and worth its weight in silver. It was profitable work, and it took him across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to the ports of Greece and beyond. He was good at it, and his future must have seemed clear. He would build on his father's trade. He would prosper. He would live the comfortable life of a successful merchant in a city that understood commerce. He would grow old, surrounded by the things that successful merchants are surrounded by, and he would die having played his part in the ordinary drama of commerce and family and civic life. Then his ship went down. The date is uncertain, and the details vary depending on which ancient source you read, but the essential fact is agreed upon. Zeno was sailing with a cargo of purple dye when his ship was wrecked. The cargo was lost. The wealth it represented was gone. And Zeno, who had been a prosperous young merchant sailing familiar routes, found himself suddenly and completely impoverished on the shore at Athens. He was around 30 years old. The conventional response to such a disaster would have been grief, followed by determination to rebuild, to find a new cargo, to borrow money from contacts, to get back into the trading business and restore what had been lost. This is what a sensible person would have done. This is what almost anyone would have done. Zeno went to a bookshop. The story, as the ancient sources tell it, is both too neat and perfectly true in the way that the most revealing stories are. In the bookshop, Zeno picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, the account of the life and teachings of Socrates. He read it standing in the shop, unable to put it down, and when he had finished, he looked up at the bookseller and asked where he could find men like the ones described in the book. At that moment, a philosopher named Crates of Thebes happened to be walking past the shop, and the bookseller pointed to him and said, "Follow that man." So Zeno followed him. What this story captures is something important about the nature of Zeno's response to his disaster. Most people, when they lose their livelihood, think about how to get it back. Zeno, when he lost his livelihood, thought about what it had really been worth. The cargo of purple dye was gone and could not be recovered. But what else had been lost? He was alive. he was in Athens, one of the great intellectual capitals of the world. He had his mind and his curiosity and his ability to think. What exactly had the shipwreck taken from him that mattered? This is the question that would eventually become Stoicism. It is buried here in the origin story, in the gap between what happened and what Zeno did about it. He did not respond to loss the way loss is supposed to be responded to. He responded to it the way a philosopher responds. By asking what the loss revealed, Crates of Thebes was a follower of the Cynic school of philosophy, a tradition founded by Diogenes of Sinope, the man who famously lived in a barrel and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. The Cynics believed that conventional society was a collection of false values, and that the only path to genuine happiness was the rejection of everything. Conventional, wealth, reputation, comfort, social respectability, all of it was in the Cynic view a trap, a set of external goods whose pursuit made you a slave and whose loss left you broken. Crates himself had been a wealthy man who had given away everything he owned to live as a wandering philosopher. He practiced what he preached in the most literal possible way. He was deliberately provocative, deliberately indifferent to what other people thought, deliberately free of every attachment to material things. He and his wife Hipparchia, who was herself a remarkable philosopher, lived and taught in public with a complete disregard for the social norms that governed respectable Athenian life. This was the tradition that Zeno entered when he followed Crates down the street in Athens. It was a tradition that took the question of what actually matters with absolute seriousness and answered it with absolute ruthlessness. Nothing external matters. Only virtue matters. Virtue is the only true good, and everything else is indifferent. Zeno studied with Crates for years. He absorbed the Cynic arguments and took them seriously. But he was also troubled by something in the Cynic approach. The Cynics were right that external things were not the source of genuine happiness, but their response to this insight, the deliberate flouting of all social convention, the performance of shamelessness, the theatrical rejection of everything ordinary. This did not seem quite right to Zeno either. It seemed like a reaction to the world rather than an understanding of it. It seemed to replace one kind of slavery with another. The slavery to convention was replaced by the slavery to unconventionality. You were still being defined by your relationship to what other people thought. Just now you were defined by your contempt for it rather than your anxiety about it. Zeno wanted something more deeply free than this. After studying with Crates, Zeno also studied with other philosophers in Athens. He attended the academy founded by Plato and studied with its current head Xenocrates. He listened to the Megarian philosophers who were developing rigorous systems of logic. He absorbed the work of Aristotle through his followers. He was not a man who arrived at his philosophy quickly or carelessly. He spent years learning everything that had been thought before him and testing it against his own experience and his own sense of what was true. Around 300 BC, when he was approximately 35 years old, Zeno began teaching his own philosophy. He did not found a school in the conventional sense. He did not build an academy or establish a formal institution. He did what Socrates had done. He walked and talked and gathered around him people who wanted to think seriously about how to live. The place where he taught was the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a long covered walkway on the north side of the Athenian agora, decorated with famous paintings of Greek military victories. It was a public space that anyone could enter, not a private institution for the privileged few, merchants and slaves. And citizens and foreigners all walked through the Stoa Poikile, and anyone who stopped to listen to Zeno was welcome. This openness was not accidental. It reflected something essential about what Zeno was teaching, the choice of a public space. Rather than a private school was itself a philosophical statement. Plato had taught in a private garden called the Academy. Aristotle had taught in a private gymnasium called the Lyceum. Both of these were places with controlled access. Places where the conversation was among people who had been selected or who could afford to participate. Zeno chose to teach in the street, or as close to the street as a covered walkway could be, in the middle of the most public space in Athens. The agora where merchants traded and politicians argued and ordinary Athenians went about their daily business. This meant that his philosophy was available to anyone who happened to be walking by and stopped to listen. The slave running an errand. For his master could stop and hear Zeno just as well as the wealthy citizen of leisure. His followers came to be called Stoics. From the Greek word for porch, stoa, it is one of the more modest names a philosophical movement has ever been given. Not named after its founder like Platonism or Aristotelianism. Not named after a grand concept, just named after the place where the conversations happened. The porch where a Phoenician merchant who had lost everything sat and asked the people who gathered around him what it meant to be free. The philosophy that emerged from those conversations under the painted porch was something genuinely new in the history of human thought. It drew on the Cynic tradition and on Platonic idealism and on the logical rigor of the Megarian school. But it synthesized these into something that was more systematic, more livable, and in some ways more radical than any of its predecessors. The Cynics had been right that external goods were not the source of genuine happiness, but they had expressed this insight in a way that was essentially negative by rejecting and mocking and flouting the conventional world. Zeno wanted to express the same insight in a positive form, not as a rejection of the world, but as an understanding of it. Not as a performance of freedom, but as the actual thing. The freedom that does not need to prove itself by shocking other people because it is not in competition with other people's opinions at all. This required building a much more comprehensive philosophical system than the Cynics had attempted. It required an account of the nature of the cosmos and the nature of the human being and the relationship between them. It required a theory of knowledge and a theory of language and a theory of logic that could support the ethical conclusions Zeno wanted to draw. It required working out in detail what virtue actually is and what the relationship between virtue and the other things that people pursue actually amounts to. All of this Zeno began, and all of his successors extended and refined over the following centuries. At the center of the Stoic philosophy was a distinction so simple it seems obvious and so profound it has never stopped being revolutionary. The distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us, what is within our control and what is not within our control. What is up to us, Zeno taught, is our own mind, our own judgments, our own desires and aversions, our own will. The inner life that we conduct invisibly behind the face we present to the world. This and only this is genuinely ours, genuinely within our power, genuinely free. What is not up to us is everything else, our body, our reputation, our wealth, our relationships, the opinions other people hold about us, whether we succeed or fail at external tasks, whether the ship goes down or arrives safely in harbor, whether the plague comes or passes us by, whether the emperor is benevolent or cruel, whether the world is just or unjust. This is the foundation of everything that follows. This distinction between the inner and the outer, between the will and the world. This is what Zeno discovered or clarified or articulated more precisely than anyone before him when he stood on the Athenian shore after his shipwreck and looked at what remained of himself when everything external was gone. What remained was considerable. The Stoic system, as Zeno developed it, was divided into three parts: logic, physics, and ethics. And all three were held together by the idea that the universe is a rational system governed by a principle they called the logos, a Greek word that means reason or word or principle, the divine intelligence that runs through all things and constitutes the fundamental nature of reality. The Stoics believed that the universe is not a random collection of matter moving according to no principle. It is a living whole suffused with reason, and human beings are the part of that whole in which the logos becomes self-aware. We are the universe knowing itself, and our capacity for reason is not separate from the reason that governs the cosmos, but is a piece of it. A fragment of the divine fire, as they sometimes described it, embedded in us and constituting the most essential part of what we are. This is why virtue was so central to Stoic ethics. Virtue is the proper exercise of our reason. It is what we do when we use the divine faculty within us the way it was meant to be used. When we think clearly and judge rightly and respond to the world the way a rational being ought to respond. Virtue is not one good thing among others. It is not weighed against wealth or pleasure or reputation in some calculation of what produces the best life. It is the only genuine good because it is the only thing that is genuinely ours and genuinely an expression of what we most essentially are. Everything else, the Stoics said, is preferred indifferent or dispreferred indifferent. These are technical terms that have sometimes been misunderstood. When the Stoics said that health and wealth and reputation were indifferent, they did not mean that it did not matter whether you were healthy or sick, rich or poor, respected or despised. Of course, it matters in a practical sense. Health is better then sickness, and abundance is better than poverty, and being respected by your community is better than being despised. A rational person will prefer these things and will work to obtain them. But they are indifferent in the sense that they do not determine whether your life is genuinely good. A sick person can be virtuous and therefore genuinely happy. A poor person can be virtuous and therefore genuinely happy. A person who is despised and persecuted and ultimately executed can be virtuous and therefore genuinely happy. The external circumstances are the stage set on which you live your life. They constrain what is possible, but they do not determine whether you respond to those constraints well or badly. And it is in the responding, in the quality of your inner engagement with whatever circumstances you find yourself in, that the quality of your life actually resides. This is what Zeno had glimpsed on the shore after the shipwreck. Everything external can be taken: the cargo, the ship, the wealth, the plans, the future you thought you had. All of it can be removed in an afternoon by a storm at sea. And you are still there. The thing that is most essentially you is still there. The question is what you will do with it. The Stoics went further than this. They developed the idea with a psychological precision that is remarkable given how long ago they were working. They noticed that the source of most human suffering is not the bad things that happen to us, but our judgments about those things. Our insistence that what has happened should not have happened, our resistance to the way things are, our attachment to outcomes we cannot control. This is what generates the anguish. Not the event itself, but our response to it, and the response is up to us. This does not mean that grief is wrong, or that it is somehow a failure to feel pain when painful things happen. The Stoics were not advocating for the suppression of emotion or for a kind of stony indifference to everything that happens. They Distinguish carefully between the involuntary reactions that happen before reason can intervene. The sudden fear when you see a snake, the initial shock when you receive bad news, and the emotional states that we maintain through our ongoing judgments. The extended grief that becomes a way of life, the chronic anxiety that we feed with our own thoughts, the resentment that we nurse and cultivate long after the original injury. The first category they called propathe, pre-passions or preliminary emotions, and they accepted these as natural and inevitable. Even the Stoic sage could not prevent the first flutter of fear, the initial wince of pain, the spontaneous tears at a funeral. What the sage could do was not add to these initial reactions with further judgments, not build on them with stories about why this was unbearable and ought not to have happened and prove that the universe was unjust or that he himself was a failure. The sage received the initial shock and let it be what it was, a passing state, and did not transform it into a permanent feature of his inner landscape by insisting on it. Zeno himself, by all accounts, embodied the philosophy he taught with a consistency that is remarkable and slightly intimidating. The ancient sources describe a man of extraordinary self-discipline and personal simplicity. He ate and drank sparingly, he dressed simply, he owned little, he required almost nothing to be comfortable. These were not performances of austerity. They were not the cynic, theatrical rejection of conventional comforts. They were simply the natural expression of a man who had genuinely internalized the idea that external things were not the source of his well-being. He was spare in his conversation too. The ancient accounts describe a man who was not given to lengthy speeches or elaborate rhetoric, who said what he meant clearly and then stopped, who did not feel the need to fill silence with words, who could deliver a philosophical point in a single sentence and leave it there for the listener to work with. There is something attractive in this to anyone who has sat through lectures padded 2-3 times their necessary length. Zeno apparently said exactly what needed to be said and trusted his listeners to be intelligent enough to take it from there. He was also, by all accounts, exceptionally kind, patient, and genuinely interested in the people around him. There was nothing cold about his simplicity, nothing harsh about his self-discipline. He did not impose his standards on others, or look down on people who lived more comfortably or enjoyed pleasures he did not himself require. The freedom from external dependence that he practiced was a freedom for something, for genuine engagement with the world and with the people in it, not a freedom from the world. The ancient sources record a number of his sayings, and they have a quality of dry precision that is consistent with the picture of the man. Someone asked him how a person should relate to philosophy, and he said, the way a good dyer prepares the fabric before applying the color, meaning that you have to prepare yourself properly before the ideas can take hold. You cannot just hear them and expect them to transform you. You have to be ready for them. You have to do the preparatory work of honest self-examination that makes genuine philosophical change possible. He taught for decades under the painted porch, gathering around him students who would eventually carry his ideas across the Mediterranean world and into the Roman Empire, where Stoicism would reach its greatest influence. Men like Cleanthes, who succeeded him as head of the Stoic school, and Chrysippus, who would systematize and elaborate the philosophy into its classical form. These were the people who turned Zeno's insights into a comprehensive philosophical system that would endure for centuries. The Athenians held Zeno in extraordinary esteem. The city that had executed Socrates for corrupting the youth with his philosophical questioning honored Zeno with a golden crown and a public decree praising his contributions to the city. The decree survives, and it is worth noting what it says. It praises Zeno not for intellectual achievement in the abstract, but for the consistency between his teaching and his life. For being the kind of person whose philosophy was not a set of claims he made, but a set of practices he lived. For making the young men who spent time with him better people by the example of his own conduct as much as by the content of his arguments. The Athenian king Antigonus Gonatas was among Zeno's admirers. He visited the philosopher regularly, and on one occasion tried to persuade Zeno to come and live at his court. An invitation that would have brought Zeno into one of the most powerful royal households in the Greek world. Zeno declined. He was not interested in proximity to power, and he was not interested in the comforts that proximity to power would bring. He sent instead 2 of his students to represent Stoic philosophy at the court, which was a considerably more Stoic response than accepting the invitation himself would have been. This was always what Zeno cared about most. Not the abstract correctness of a philosophical system, but the practical question of how a human being actually becomes free. How a person actually learns to live in a way that is not at the mercy of everything that happens to them. There is a dimension of Stoic philosophy that does not always receive the attention it deserves when Stoicism is discussed in modern contexts. And that is its cosmopolitanism, its radical insistence on the unity of all human beings, regardless of their origin, their citizenship, their social class, their gender, or any other external characteristic. Zeno was himself a foreigner in Athens, a Phoenician in a Greek world that prized Greek ancestry, and this outsider status was surely part of what drove him to articulate a view of human identity that went beyond the particular and the local. When he looked at the world, he did not see Greeks and Phoenicians and Persians and Egyptians. He saw human beings, each of whom possessed the same fundamental capacity for reason and therefore the same fundamental dignity. The idea of the cosmopolis, the city of the world, the community of all rational beings that transcends all particular cities and nations. This was one of Zeno's most original and most radical contributions. The Stoics believed that you owe your primary allegiance not to the city you were born in or the nation you belong to or the ethnic group you come from, but to the community of all rational beings, which is to say to all human beings, and ultimately to the rational cosmos itself, of which we are all part. This was a genuinely revolutionary idea in a world that was organized entirely around particularistic loyalties, where your identity was defined by your city, your family, your tribe, where the stranger was by definition less fully human than the person who shared your blood and your customs. Zeno said no. The stranger is your fellow citizen in the only city that ultimately matters. The city of reason, the city of the world. This cosmopolitan dimension of Stoic thought had enormous influence on the development of Roman ideas about universal law and the rights of persons. The Roman Stoics built on this foundation to develop something like the concept of natural law. The idea that there are moral principles that apply to all human beings, regardless of their citizenship, and that no human authority has the right to override. This Stoic idea traveled through medieval natural law theory and eventually into the modern concepts of universal human rights and the dignity of persons. When Zeno walked along the painted porch in Athens and told the people who gathered around him that they were all citizens of the same world, the implications were not worked out immediately. They took centuries to unfold. They are still unfolding. The idea that all human beings share a fundamental dignity that no power can legitimately violate is a Stoic idea. It is one of the most important ideas in the history of moral thought. And it began with a Phoenician merchant who had just lost his ship. The The Stoics also developed a striking doctrine about the equality of vice and virtue. They argued that all virtuous actions were equally virtuous and all vicious actions equally vicious. That there were no degrees in the moral realm. You were either being fully rational and therefore fully virtuous, or you were not. This doctrine was widely mocked in antiquity, and it is easy to see why it seems extreme to say that a minor lie and a great crime are equally vicious. But there was something important in the Stoic insistence on this point. They were trying to resist the very human tendency to give ourselves partial credit for being almost good, to congratulate ourselves on small virtues while tolerating significant vices. The Stoic framework was designed to be uncompromising in its standard precisely because the human capacity for self-deception is so powerful and so persistent. Zeno died around 262 BC. He was approximately 70 years old. The ancient sources report that he died by holding his breath. A death that sounds like a legend, but which may reflect something real about the Stoic idea that the wise man does not cling to life when it is no longer worth living, that life itself is among the things that are preferred but not unconditionally. So, his successor as head of the Stoic school was Cleanthes, a former boxer who had come to Athens to pursue philosophy, and who worked as a water carrier at night to support himself while studying during the day. Cleanthes possessed a philosophical temperament that was more religious and more poetic than Zeno's. He wrote a hymn to Zeus that survives, and that represents one of the most beautiful expressions of the Stoic vision of the cosmos as a rational, divine whole. The hymn praises Zeus not as a personal deity who intervenes in human affairs, but as the principle of reason that suffuses all things and orders all things, and toward which all rational beings can orient themselves. After Cleanthes came Chrysippus, the third head of the school, a philosopher of extraordinary systematic intelligence who elaborated Stoic logic, physics, and ethics into the comprehensive framework that would become the classical Stoic system. It was said in antiquity that if there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoic school. The ideas that Zeno had originated and Cleanthes had kept alive, Chrysippus turned into a philosophical architecture of remarkable solidity and depth. But these men, while important, are not the names that most people know when they hear the word Stoicism. The names most people know came later. They came when the Stoic philosophy crossed from Athens to Rome and was taken up by a cast of characters so varied and so remarkable that they constitute one of the most extraordinary collections of minds in the history of philosophy. There was Cicero, the great orator and statesman, who was not himself a Stoic, but whose philosophical writings transmitted Stoic ideas to Rome and to the Latin-speaking world with an eloquence and a clarity that made them accessible to readers who could not read Greek. Cicero wrote during one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history, when the republic he loved was being destroyed by the ambitions of Julius Caesar and then of his successors, and the Stoic themes of doing your duty regardless of outcomes, of finding your integrity in the quality of your effort rather than the success of your results, resonated with a man who kept trying to save the republic even when he could see that it was lost. There was Cato the Younger, the Roman senator who opposed Julius Caesar with a ferocity that was entirely Stoic in its character, who cared nothing for his own life or comfort or safety, but only for the republic and for the integrity of his own principles, who, when he saw that the cause was lost and Caesar would win, refused to live under a tyranny and killed himself. A death that Romans remembered and admired for centuries as the purest expression of Stoic freedom. The freedom that cannot be taken because it can be surrendered but never stolen. Cato understood with complete clarity that his body was not his most essential possession, and that Caesar could take his body but could not take the principles by which he had lived. This is Stoicism not as a therapy for anxiety, but as a foundation for political courage, for the willingness to act rightly at personal cost, because the alternative is to live in a way that is beneath the dignity of a rational being. There was Seneca, the immensely wealthy philosopher and playwright and tutor to the Emperor Nero, whose letters and essays represent perhaps the most direct and accessible expression of Stoic ideas that antiquity produced. Seneca was a complicated figure, a man who preached simplicity while living in luxury, who wrote about the shortness of life while devoting enormous energy to political maneuvering, who understood the Stoic ideal perfectly and fell short of it in many ways, and who was in his writings about this gap between the ideal and the actual. More honest than most philosophers have been, he said explicitly that he was not a sage and did not pretend to be one. He was a person making progress, fallible, inconsistent, trying. Seneca wrote letters to a friend named Lucilius that are among the most readable philosophical texts in any language. They cover everything from how to manage your time, to how to think about death, to how to deal with crowds, to what it means to be a genuine friend. They are full of observations that feel contemporary, not because Seneca was anticipating our world, but because human nature has not changed, and the pressures he was describing, the pressure to live up to other people's expectations, the tendency to measure your worth by external achievements, the difficulty of being genuinely present in your own life rather than constantly distracted by thoughts about what you should be doing or what other people think of you. These are not Roman pressures, they are human pressures. There was Epictetus, the freed slave, perhaps the most purely Stoic of all the Roman Stoics, a man who had been born into the complete absence of external freedom, who had been owned by another person and had no control over where he lived or what work he did or whether his body was harmed, and who had understood from the beginning of his thinking life that the only freedom worth having was the freedom that could not be taken by a master, the freedom of the inner life, the freedom of the will, the freedom to judge rightly regardless of what was done to the body. The teachings of Epictetus survive in a text called the Discourses recorded by his student Arrian, and in a short manual called the Enchiridion or Handbook. They are among the most direct and powerful expressions of Stoic philosophy that exist. They read like a man who is not theorizing about freedom, but reporting what freedom actually felt like from the inside. Epictetus was reportedly crippled when his master, a man named Epaphroditus, twisted his leg as a demonstration of his power over the slave. Epictetus reportedly said calmly during this process that the leg would break, and when it broke, said that he had told him it would break. This story, whether literally true or somewhat embellished, captures something essential about the Epictetan version of Stoicism. The body can be harmed, and there is no point pretending otherwise. But the response to the body being harmed, the quality of the inner life in the moment of physical suffering, this remains within the person's control. And it is this, and only this, that constitutes the person's genuine self. And there was Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, who had everything that the external world considers worth having: power, wealth, prestige, command of armies, the throne of the greatest empire in the world, and who wrote in his private journal, the Meditations, words that have been read with recognition and gratitude by human beings in every century since they were written. Words about the difficulty of being a good person, the importance of focusing on what is actually within our power, the necessity of doing good without expecting recognition, the comfort of knowing that everything external is temporary and only virtue endures. The Meditations were not written for publication. They were Marcus's private notes to himself, his daily practice of the philosophy he was trying to live, which makes them feel different from almost any other philosophical text. They are not arguments addressed to an audience, trying to persuade them of a position. They are a man talking to himself, reminding himself of truths he already knows and keeps forgetting, working through the difficulties of applying a philosophy to an actual life, in actual circumstances, with actual temptations and failures and frustrations. That a book which begins with the words from my grandfather Verus, "I learned to be gentle and meek," could have been written by an absolute monarch is itself a testament to the power of the philosophy that Zeno began under the painted porch in Athens 3.5 centuries earlier. It is a remarkable thing about the philosophy that Zeno originated that it has never lost its relevance. It has gone through periods of greater and lesser influence. It was central to Roman intellectual culture for centuries, and then went into relative eclipse during the medieval period when Christian philosophy dominated Western thought. But it never disappeared entirely, and in every age people who encountered it recognized in it something true and important and applicable to their own lives. In the 20th century, Stoicism was rediscovered by cognitive behavioral therapy, the most widely practiced form of psychotherapy in the contemporary world. Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, who developed the foundations of CBT, drew explicitly on Stoic ideas, particularly the Stoic insight that it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about events. This is essentially the philosophical foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea that by examining and changing our thoughts and interpretations of events, we can change our emotional responses to them. Ellis himself cited Epictetus as a major influence and saw his therapy as a practical application of Stoic principles to the treatment of psychological suffering. The specific Stoic idea that Ellis was drawing on is the idea that the event itself and the emotional response to the event are not the same thing and are not directly connected. Between the event and the emotion, there is always a judgment and an interpretation, a story we tell ourselves about what the event means and what it implies and what it requires of us. And that story is something we can examine and change. A person who loses their job and tells themselves that this proves they are worthless and that their life is now ruined will feel something very different from a person who loses their job and tells themselves that this is a difficult situation. That requires practical response, and that their worth as a person is not determined by their employment status. The event is the same, the response is different. And the difference is in the judgment. This is what the Stoics had been saying for 2,500 years before CBT was invented. It is not events that disturb us, but our opinions about events. When we strip away the opinion and look at the event itself, we often find that what we took to be unbearable is actually just difficult. What we took to be catastrophic is actually just inconvenient. What we told ourselves was the end of everything is actually just a change in circumstances that requires adaptation. The appeal of Stoicism in the modern world is not surprising when you consider the specific anxieties that characterize contemporary life. We live in a time of extraordinary abundance and extraordinary instability simultaneously. More people than ever before in human history have access to more material goods and more information and more opportunity than any previous generation. And more people than ever before in human history report feeling anxious and overwhelmed, and unable to find the kind of stable satisfaction in their lives that they feel they should be feeling given all they have. The Stoic diagnosis of this situation would be simple and not very comfortable to hear. The anxiety comes from looking for your well-being in the wrong places, from trying to find stability in things that are inherently unstable, from making your sense of yourself dependent on factors that you do not control and that can be taken from you. The remedy is not to acquire more of these things, but to change your relationship to them, to hold them lightly, to appreciate them without clinging to them, to prefer them without requiring them. This is not a counsel of passivity. The Stoics were not saying that you should stop trying to improve your circumstances or stop working toward the things you prefer. They were saying that your inner state should not be held hostage by whether those efforts succeed. You do the work and you prefer the outcome, and you accept what actually happens. This combination of genuine effort with genuine acceptance is harder than either resigned indifference or driven anxiety, but it is also, the Stoics would argue, the only combination that actually works. The modern Stoic revival, which has produced best-selling books and podcasts and online communities of remarkable size, draws on exactly these themes. The books of Ryan Holiday, who has done more than anyone in recent decades to make Stoic ideas accessible to a modern audience. The annual Stoic Week exercises practiced by tens of thousands of participants around the world. The communities of people who read the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or the letters of Seneca, or the discourses of Epictetus, and recognize in them something that speaks directly to the difficulties of their own lives. The Stoics are having a moment, and the reason they are having a moment is that the questions they were asking are questions that are always relevant, because they are questions about human nature and not about the specific circumstances of any particular age. There is also in Stoic philosophy a resource for dealing with the specific anxieties of the modern world that goes beyond the general principles. The Stoics developed specific exercises and practices for training the mind toward virtue and freedom. They practiced what they called negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of loss, imagining that the things you value are gone or taken. Not as an exercise in morbidity, but as a way of appreciating what you have before it is gone and of reminding yourself that you can survive its loss. They practiced the view from above, the deliberate effort to see your own situation from a great distance, from the perspective of the cosmos, which has the effect of loosening the grip of the small, immediate anxieties that dominate ordinary consciousness. They practiced the discipline of desire, the careful examination of what you want, and why you want it, and whether the wanting is actually serving your well-being or undermining it. These are practical exercises, not abstract principles, and they are as applicable now as they were in Athens in 300 BC, because human psychology has not changed. We are still the same beings that Zeno was trying to help, still capable of the same errors and the same wisdom, still capable of confusing the external for the essential, still capable of learning the difference. Zeno himself would perhaps be pleased and perhaps also slightly bewildered by the extent of his influence. He was a modest man who chose a covered walkway rather than a grand building as his classroom, who gave his school a name that referred to the physical space rather than to himself, who, according to all ancient accounts, cared more about weather. His students became better people than about whether they remembered his name or attributed their improvement to him. He has had more than his share of historical recognition. His name is known, his ideas persist. The philosophy he began has influenced how millions of people in dozens of centuries have thought about what freedom means and how it is obtained. But the recognition would have been less important to him than the question he would have wanted to ask every person who encountered his ideas. Not, do you find this persuasive? Not, do you agree with the metaphysics? But are you actually doing anything differently? Is there something you wanted and now hold more lightly? Is there something that happened that you have stopped insisting should not have happened? Is there some part of your inner life that is a little more genuinely yours than it was before? That is the question Zeno spent his life asking, and it is the question his philosophy leaves with everyone who encounters it. The world that Zeno lived in was violent and unpredictable. Empires rose and fell with terrifying speed. Alexander, who had overturned the entire Persian Empire, died young, and his empire immediately dissolved into war among his successors. Whole populations were enslaved or displaced. The individual human being was at the mercy of enormous forces that cared nothing for their preferences or their plans. In this world, the Stoic philosophy was not a luxury or an intellectual game. It was a survival strategy, a way of finding solid ground when everything outside was shifting. But there is something important to note about this: the Stoic response to an unpredictable and violent world was not to become indifferent to it. It was not to withdraw from it. It was not to stop caring about justice or about the well-being of other people. Quite the opposite. The Stoic view was that precisely because external outcomes were uncertain and could not be guaranteed, the only reliable basis for action was virtue. For the sage, the right action is the same whether it succeeds or fails, whether the emperor approves or disapproves, whether the outcome is good or terrible. You do what is right because it is right, not because it will produce the outcome you want. And this means that nothing that happens can stop you from doing it. This is a profound and in some ways difficult idea. We are accustomed to justifying our actions by their results. We try to do good because good actions produce good outcomes. But the Stoics pointed out that this reasoning makes us dependent on factors outside our control. If doing good only makes sense when it produces good outcomes, then we can always find a reason to stop doing it. The outcomes might not materialize. The circumstances might not cooperate. The world might not respond the way we hoped. The Stoic sage does good because goodness is the proper activity of a rational being. Because virtue is what human beings are for, in the same way that the proper activity of a knife is cutting. Not because the universe will reward it, not because other people will recognize it, not because the outcomes will justify it. And this means that nothing can stop the sage from being good because nothing external is a condition for it. This is what Cato understood when he chose death rather than submission to Caesar. It is what Epictetus understood when he was a slave. It is what Marcus Aurelius was reaching for when he wrote his Meditations in a military tent on the frontier of the empire, the freedom that Zeno had glimpsed on the shore in Athens, the freedom that exists entirely within the person and cannot be touched by anything external. There is a line in Epictetus that captures this perfectly. Men are disturbed, not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. This is the Stoic insight in its most compressed form, and it is the beginning of the most important kind of freedom. The freedom that begins not with changing your circumstances, but with examining your relationship to them. 2,500 years have passed since Zeno walked to a bookshop in Athens and asked where he could find men like Socrates. The world has changed in ways he could not have imagined. The technologies would be incomprehensible to him. The political arrangements would be foreign. The scale of the civilizations that have risen since his time would stagger him. And yet the question he dedicated his life to is not a day older than it was when he asked it. What is actually in your control, not in the abstract? Not as a philosophical exercise, but right now, in the specific circumstances of your specific life, with the specific anxieties and attachments and resentments and fears that you carry. what is genuinely within your power and what is not, and what would change if you stopped spending your energy on the second category and devoted it entirely to the first? This is what Zeno of Citium gave the world, not the answer to that question. Because the answer is different for everyone and can only be found through the work of genuine self-examination. But the question itself, clear and precise and undodgeable, the question that the shipwreck forced him to ask and that he spent the rest of his life helping other people to hear, the Stoa Poikal no longer stands. The painted porch is gone. The city of Athens, where Zeno walked and taught, has been built over and transformed many times across 2.5 millennia. But the question is still there. It will always be there. It is not the kind of question that goes away just because nobody's asking it. It waits for the person who is ready to stop avoiding it and actually sit with it. That person might be you. It might be right now. It might be that somewhere in what you have just heard there is something that landed differently than the rest. Something that pointed at a place in your own life where you have been confusing the stage set for the play, the external for the essential, the circumstances for the response to the circumstances. If so, that is the gift that a Phoenician merchant who lost his ship in the Mediterranean more than 2,000 years ago is still giving to the world. The ship went down and Zeno walked into a bookshop and the rest of it, all of it, 2,500 years are one of the most important ideas in the history of human thought. Followed from that, we should end where we began, on a shore in Athens, with a man who has just lost everything. He is around 30 years old. He is a foreigner in a city that values its own citizens above outsiders. He has no money and no cargo, and no ship and no clear path forward, the comfortable life that he had been building. The merchant enterprise that would have defined his existence for decades is at the bottom of the sea. He could be broken by this. Many people would be. Many people are broken by much less than this, and there would be no shame in it. The loss is real and it is enormous, and the world does not owe Zeno a good outcome and will not deliver one simply because he needs it. But Zeno is not broken. He is something much stranger and more interesting than broken. He is awake in a way he was not awake before. The shipwreck has stripped away the layer of assumption that covered his life and revealed the question underneath. What is actually worth having? What is it that the sea cannot take from you? What is it that survives when everything external is gone? The answer he arrived at over the following decades of teaching and thinking and living was not complicated and it was not comfortable. It was the simplest and hardest thing imaginable. What survives is the quality of how you respond to what happens to you. What survives is virtue. What survives is the inner life that you have built through the daily practice of examining your judgments and your desires and your fears and asking whether they are genuinely yours or whether you have simply absorbed them from the world without examination. This sounds almost too simple. It sounds like the kind of thing that anyone could say and nobody actually lives. And it is true that nobody lives it perfectly. The Stoics themselves never claimed that the sage was a common figure. They treated the perfectly virtuous person as an ideal that directed practice without being realistically attained. But direction is everything. The question of what actually matters and what is genuinely within your control is not a question you answer once and never have to face again. It is a question you face every morning and in every difficulty and in every moment. When you are tempted to hand your peace of mind over to something outside yourself and let it determine how you feel. Zeno asked this question on a shore in Athens 2,500 years ago, and the asking of it echoes through the Stoa Poikal and through the Roman Synodon, through every age since then where someone picked up a Stoic text and recognized in it the shape of something true. The porch where he taught is gone. The paintings that decorated it are gone. Most of what he wrote is gone. We know his philosophy mainly through the writings of the people who came after him. The Stoic tradition preserved and extended and applied in the centuries following his death. But the question is not gone. The question is indestructible. It does not need a building or a text to survive. It survives in every person who faces a genuine difficulty, and instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" asks, "What can I do with this?" It survives in every person who holds something they love lightly enough to still be whole when it goes. It survives in every person who does the right thing, not because the outcome will reward them, but because it is the right thing, and they are the kind of person who does right things. The ship went down, and Zeno walked into a bookshop and asked a question, and everything else followed from that. It always does.